welcome to the Scramble. Thanks for joining us. I'm Tomi Lahren. We have some pressing issues to address today, both right here in our backyard and around the world. First, we'll discuss the alleged North Korean crimes against humanity as reported by the United Nations. Next, we'll move to a discussion on the restoration of voting rights for felons right here in the Silver State. And finally, we'll discuss the recent uprising in Ukraine and what it means for the United States and our allies. But before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to introduce our panelists. Returning to the panel, we have Ryan Hamilton, a graduate student in journalism and media studies. Also returning, we have Alex Velto, a junior in political science with a minor in Brookings public policy. We welcome back David Serabian, a former State Department intern and senior in political science. And last but not least, making her return to the panel, we have Sara Montes, a graduate student in journalism and media studies. Welcome all, and thanks for being here. Well, last week, the United Nations investigators determined that North Korea has committed countless crimes against humanity. Relying on survivor testimony, the UN reported crimes ranging from unjustified executions, rape, forced enslavement and abortions, as well as religious, racial, and gender persecution. UN investigators recommend the case be taken up by the International Criminal Court. However, this would require support from the UN Security Council, where China, North Korea's longtime ally, would almost certainly block the action. What are your thoughts on this investigation? How likely is it that North Korea will be receiving justice? What do you guys think? Sara?
I almost think they probably won't for a while. I mean, this has been clearly going on for some time, and I mean, nothing's really been done yet. And you know, it's this continuation of North Korean society, and I mean, they've been separated from South Korea. I don't know if you saw or read up on the report where they had South Koreans travel or have a reunion with their families. And just how touching and how crazy it's been. You know, these people have been separated from their family members for years. So I read an article in the New York Times about that, and I found that to be really kind of compelling and just kind of caught me, or touched me really.
So do you think that this new investigation is going to change things? Do you think that puts more pressure on the rest of the world to intervene?
It definitely puts more pressure. Whether or not it's going to happen, though, is, I guess, something that continues to be questioned. I mean, I hope it does. I really do. I think all of us can agree that, I mean, this is horrible. You know, going back to what World War II, what Hitler did with the Nazis, it's almost bringing it up again. So.
Absolutely. David, I know that you're a foreign policy expert. What do you think about these latest revelations by the UN?
Well, it's nothing surprising. They've been doing this for quite some time already. It's just finally out there with the UN report. And I mean, obviously, like you pointed out, that it's very touching when the families get together. Obviously, the Koreas want to unify. It's just exactly how. North Korea wants to do it with violence, and it's going to be an issue I doubt there'll be much progress with this UN report. Because what's the UN going to force North Korea to do? North Korea has nuclear weapons and the largest number of special operations forces in the world. And they have China as an ally. And one thing that's of major note is that the uncle that was killed, he was the main point of contact for the Chinese government in back channels to discuss with the North Koreans. And so the Chinese are going to be acting very cautiously because their main point of contact is dead. And
you think that puts a little bit more pressure on the situation?
It puts more pressure on the situation because even China, North Korea's longtime ally, doesn't have as clear of a picture as they used to of what's going on in there. And I'm sure they knew about this before. And obviously, I'm not sure how much is going to come from this, but it just shows that North Korea keeps doing what they always do, which is human rights violations and the like.
Now, Alex, these are pretty horrendous crimes. What do you think about the situation?
Well, I think there's some hope with what China will end up doing, that they could end up pressuring North Korea to kind of improve. I want to say it was a few years ago they were pressured into condemning North Korea. They didn't actually push it to the ICC, but that would be the hope of this. But because Russia decided not to align with them in vetoing the action, they couldn't necessarily veto, and they typically don't like to veto when they're the only person there. So unless Russia aligns with them in opposing North Korea, it seems like that won't. It seems like they won't be able to hold strong too long. I don't think intervention is inevitable, but I do think that China will increasingly find it difficult as they emerge as a world power to kind of align with a country that has such horrendous human rights abuses. So hopefully they'll come to their senses and realize it's not good for them.
But China's a country with horrendous human rights abuses itself. I think it's worth noting. It's difficult for me to see them as kind of the knight on shining armor coming to the rescue of the North Korean people. I think this is instructive of two things. The first is what happens when you give the government too much power. And I think we should always be vigilant against doing that. The second thing is that we kind of blew the end game when we had a chance to get out in front of this problem. And I think we'll discuss this in the Ukraine later on in the show, is that before this all happened, when the United States was engaged in the Korean War, we tried the policy of containment, which essentially trapped North Koreans in this country because we didn't want to continue to fight the war. And now I think we're seeing a problem that's grown in size and scope because we didn't want to invest on the front end. And I think that our foreign policy has got to be a little bit more farsighted when and if we do decide to intervene in countries. This is particularly true in Afghanistan, when after we supported the militia, we'll say, Mujahideen, that we didn't want to pay for the schools or the infrastructure to help stabilize that country in the aftermath. So I think there's little to be done at this point from my perspective, but I do think that we can take a lot of lessons from North Korea.
Okay, and I want to give you the last word on this as well. Just bringing up the United States, you brought up the role of the United States in this. Do you think we should be more concerned about human rights issues in North Korea, or should we just focus our attention on the possible nuclear weapons there?
Well, both. I think that they're interrelated. You know, this government is pursuing two avenues. It's terrorizing its own people while searching new devices to terrorize people outside of its borders. So I think that it's got to be a holistic policy approach.
I don't necessarily know if the nuclear weapons are that big of an issue. Like, they have them, they don't have the missiles to launch them. They have empirically failed at launching them. We also are developing an air-sea battle program just off the coast of China, which would be able to shoot down any missiles if they were launched towards the west. So I think the missiles are kind of like a non-starter. Like, you have one weapon missile, you're not going to use it because then you lose it. So the big issue is the human rights abuses and the effect it has on the people of the country.
I guess it remains to be seen what the intervention will be, and hopefully the UN investigation will move forward on this. And we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back to discuss voter restoration for felons.
Oh, hey, bud.
Oh.
Where are you headed?
Just gonna hang out.
It's a school night. With Gary and Todd?
Yeah?
Not sure about those two. I've been meaning to ask you. This is tougher than I thought. Is there any drinking going on in this crowd?
No.
I hope not, because alcohol can lead you to say things and do things that you really wish you hadn't. Isn't this what you're supposed to say?
I know.
So if any of your buddies ever pressure you to take a drink, just tell them you promised your dad you wouldn't. I'd do anything to keep you safe.
Okay, I will.
I hope this is working.
I promise. Love you too, Dad.
They really do hear you.
Ryan.
Yeah?
So start the conversation even before they're teenagers.
Good idea.
For tips on what to say, visit underagedrinking.samhsa.gov. A message from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration.
Thanks for coming back with us. And speaking of crime and justice, U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder is urging Nevada and 10 other states to repeal laws banning the restoration of voting rights to convicted felons. Holder said such bans disproportionately hurt minorities and impede felon rehabilitation. Under Nevada law, voting rights are immediately restored to discharged inmates unless they are convicted of Class A or B felonies. These felonies involve violent crimes, sex offenses, or inmates with 2 or more felonies. However, next year, the Nevada legislature will have to decide whether the voting rights will be restored to prisoners convicted of violent crimes. A similar bill was vetoed by Governor Sandoval in 2011. Ryan, I know that this is a hot-button issue for you. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think that the problem with this bill is that even the author concedes that rehabilitation is a process. Okay. And what this does is the moment the sentence has been served or the inmate is paroled, rights return like that with no real consideration of whether rehabilitation has actually been achieved. And in Nevada, there exists not only a way for people convicted of lesser offenses to get their civil rights back, which is to say it's done automatically, but you can also appeal to the Board of Pardons, let's say, if you're convicted of a Class A or B felony. And they have the ability to measure rehabilitative processes to decide whether or not that person should be trusted with full franchise back into society again. So it seems to me that this is a short-sighted bill which doesn't really take into account the damage that Class A or B felons can do to other individuals, their victims in society. So I think that we have to recognize rehabilitation as a process, and that franchise should not just be immediately given back once prison time is up.
I know, Alex, you're ready to go on this.
Yeah, to answer a couple of your points you've made, you said there's a process at which you can rehabilitate, you can get a pardon. That process requires money, requires a lot of investment, which not everyone has access to, which is one of the problems because the people who are mostly affected by these laws are less affluent and typically minorities. So a lot of the issue is that while it is true that the law only applies to, that the felony A and B only applies to like violent offenders, sex offenders, it does also apply to people who are 2 times victims of a felony or 2 times felons. So that could also be drug issues. That could also be other things that are more systemic and more institutional than are simply did they commit a violent crime. I think that the larger issue is that there's a system where people are constantly trapped in cycles of poverty and are affected by institutional racism, which causes them to become more violent. It's the fact that people don't have a hope within the government because they no longer have the ability to get involved. Why are you going to act like the model civil American when you are raised by people, say, who potentially are unable to vote? You're not going to have any faith in that government. So instead, you need to give people the ability to vote. There have been studies done in Florida that show that people who have the ability to vote are less likely to be reincarcerated because they have a faith in the society and they realize that they can have an effect on it. A lot of the problems, though, are places like Florida where the laws are just ridiculous and it's very easy. Like if you've, I think one of the part of the laws is if you mess with someone's crab trap, that's enough to make it so you can't vote after you get out of prison. These are just ridiculous, and it definitely affects minority populations more than the rest of the country.
I think that that's a fair assessment. I'm just talking about Nevada, and I think our process here is very equitable.
What's the process? Can you tell me?
Yeah, the process
do you
is...
get a lawyer? Does it cost money?
No, you don't necessarily need a lawyer. You can file pro se to appear in front of the Board of Pardons, and it's not a pardon. It's just a restoration of civil rights, right? I mean, there are less than 20 applications to get civil rights restored anyway, so it's not like people are even beating down the door to get their civil rights restored after...
Because when you're stuck in a cycle of poverty, you don't always try to seize the opportunity. That's a problem. That's an affluent effect. Is people who are more affluent tend to seize the day. People that are stuck in these institutions.
So what's the solution then?
The solution is then give them the rights
let's
back.
give them the right to vote, and then that's going to solve the cycle of poverty?
Well, no, but it's a necessary step in getting them integrated back to society. It is necessary. It's
right?
necessary, but it's not sufficient.
And I'm totally advocating for it to be a step in the process. My objection is that it comes automatically with discharge from prison. A rapist should not be able to just come out of society and vote, particularly when you consider the recidivism rate of sex crimes. I think you might have a point. You might have a point when it comes to drug offenders. But when it comes to murderers, child pornographers, and other people who have literally stolen something, innocence, security, for someone else, they should have to go through a process to get their voting rights.
Then they should not be allowed out of prison if they're not rehabilitated. Otherwise, they're just at risk of hurting the community. That's a problem with them going to prison, not a problem with the
Sarah,
voting.
what do you think? Is this rehabilitation, or what do we think on this?
I honestly think that it should be a process. I'm in complete agreement with Ryan here. You know, them having given the rights back, it's like he said, you know, these people have murdered or affected someone's life by, you know, in a great amount, and to just, you know, hand them that vote, I think it should be a process. It definitely should. Like he mentioned about the whole drug addiction. Okay, if it's the felon of A, or whether it's A or B, I honestly think that, you know, if you commit it twice, it's kind of on them, not really on the people.
It's not. I mean, it's definitely on.
What about the
system.
victims? How do you feel about them? Let's say you were the victim of a traumatic, violent effect. Do you think you'd still be like, oh, you know, I kind of understand because he was in a cycle of poverty? Like, that does not excuse.
I mean, I'm going to say that you don't
dramatically violent effect that people have on others.
I'm going to say you don't know much about me, so you can't really say as to whether or not I've experienced anything like that. However, I think that people have a process of understanding and realizing that while those crimes are heinous, and if people do commit heinous acts, everyone should be given
unspeakably evil
those
acts.
People should not be allowed out of prison if the state doesn't deem them worthy of integrating back into society. That's a problem with them not being maintained in prison, not a reason why people who have been released and approved of parole cannot vote. I think
so then the solution is we just keep them in jail.
That's clearly not the solution I'm advocating.
Okay.
You're like
David,
looking
you've
at
been
the
awfully
trees when you
quiet.
should look at the
I want to
forest.
hear your thoughts, David. What do we think?
Obviously, these are rehabilitory measures, and it seems too black and white with the legislation they have so far, is because it's been brought up, you know, whether it's child pornographers or violent crimes, is doesn't seem to be a distinguishment between somebody who's a serial killer and somebody who committed manslaughter and somebody who is a rapist and somebody who's a child molester. There doesn't seem to be very many lines drawn within those. And of course, I think that people that have been rehabilitated should start to get their rights back so they can come back into society as opposed to just being shunned for the rest of their lives. That's the point of rehabilitation, to bring them back to where they used to be, because this is the criminal justice. This is a learning process. We got this from the Greeks. It's so that you can go back to normal society. And people should have that option, but at this stage, it doesn't seem like it's as clear as it should be.
It's on the bill right now.
The new legislation
not as clear as it should be.
Takes away that gray area. The existing process allows people to appeal before the Board of Pardons for reinstatement of civil rights.
Right.
And that progress, that claim to rehabilitation, can be measured and judged. You can say that somebody doesn't belong in prison, right? Let's say somebody comes out of prison. They might not commit a crime, but they still might not be ethically or morally prepared to participate in the kind of decisions that voters make. And I think that should be weighed against progress.
Sorry. I was just going to say, it's not shunned for the rest of their lives. I mean, it's a process, so it's not going to happen automatically, whether it's months or years. I mean, it just depends on the process of each individual, and every individual is different. So I would definitely say that it's not for the rest of their lives, only time.
So Sarah, you think the immediacy of this proposed law is the biggest problem?
Exactly.
People give up on the process. They give up on the faith of the process. Part of the problem with the process that you've alluded to is that some people don't have the means to pursue the pardon. Why do you think there have been so few? If there's an option, people would have taken it if it were that easy. It's not accessible to a majority of the people that are incarcerated. The second issue I have is that the characterizing that a person who, say, was a child molester, granted, terrible, but if he's released from prison, should have been rehabilitated. But the bigger issue is that your accusation that that person's vote would be able to do anywhere near to the amount of harm that they did for getting into prison is just laughable. What bills exist that they could possibly vote on that would cause that type of harm? If you can name one,
is
I'll
voting
concede.
a reward is what I would ask you.
It's absolutely a
Alex.
privilege, and it's a recognition before the law that you are whole, right? Let's say, for instance,
justify that
matter of
statement.
factually, right?
No,
like if I
justify
can
that
vote
statement.
and you can't, the law clearly considers you differently. How does it not represent a whole like
the law
a
considers
change?
a lot of people differently, and that's the problem. It considers someone who grows up in a low-income area that's black differently than it
Aside from
considers
these
someone who grows up in an affluent
theories
area
of
white.
yours, right? We've got a black and white determination. I bet you do. The black and white determination in front of the law, which is to say that if you can vote and I can't, there's a differentiation, right? And I think that that's reflective of the kind of robbery that Class A and B, particularly violent felons, take from somebody. If somebody is raped, something is gone from them from the rest of their life. If somebody is molested as a child, their innocence is stolen and can never be returned. My argument is that there should be a reciprocal vision of that in the law where those people are not considered whole before the law. It's the closest thing we have to justice, to a kind of treatment of the perpetrator as the stress of the victim.
Do you know what's unjust? The crime happening again. And you know what makes that more likely? Not giving them the right to vote. Because there are studies that show people who do not have the right to vote are more likely to commit those types of violent crimes. If your goal is to stop sexual crimes,
how do we know that's the cause in
the states
as opposed to the effect, and the effect isn't the cause here? How do I know that violent criminals are just less likely to vote? You know what I mean? Like people who commit crimes probably. No, your argument is people who can't vote are more likely to commit crime. My argument is people who commit crime are less likely to vote, right? How do you differentiate between the two?
Because there are studies shown in the states that have allowed post-felons to vote that show that they're less likely to go back to prison, and they're less likely to commit those violent crimes. Even if they're not voting, it's the opportunity to vote and the ability to participate in a civil society, which is where you develop the necessary empathy towards everyone else that exists in your society so you don't commit violent crimes towards them. This is not sufficient, I agree, but this is necessary.
I still don't know. I mean, there has to be some focus on the perpetrator, but we also have to consider the victims, particularly of violent crimes. Like when we talk about jails, we talk about the people who are in jails, the people who come out of jails. No, it's not.
It has nothing to do with their ability to vote.
But the victim has to be considered in terms of how we treat the perpetrator. Their crime isn't in a vacuum. It hurts people. People die. People are deprived of things. And if you say that it's a non sequitur, it's really insulting to victims of violent crime.
It's a non sequitur
because they have been affected by that.
No.
And the person's status, their future should come into consideration.
Because that makes them feel better about a person that was raped.
And because it's just.
That's laughable to say that.
It's not.
The point of the sentencing process is to punish the person and then to rehabilitate them.
In Alex
why do you
Velto's
keep
world,
why do you keep coming back
pat on
to
the ass.
saying how we need to bring justice to the victims. The point of them going to jail was to serve justice to the victims.
Yes.
And after they've served their crime, if they need to be, and the point is rehabilitation, if part of the rehabilitation is getting the right to vote back, which is determined by legislators, then so be it. But there ought to be a good process for it. And why you keep bringing up how there needs to be justice for the victims, it's called the law code. It's so that people that are victims can get punished.
What are the numbers as far as people who actually come out of prison and are able to vote and actually do vote? What are the numbers there? Do we know?
Are you saying that they don't
That
really
are
have
unable
a
to vote?
desire?
If they have the option, right? If they have the option, how many are actually wanting to vote?
I don't know Nevada's numbers. I know in Florida, for instance, I think it's like 18% of the black population versus, I want to say, like 2.5% of the entire population are unable to vote because of felon laws. In the global U.S., I'm not sure the number. It's probably under 2% of the total population that's available to vote. But
So what does that say, Alex? What do we think about that?
I mean, it's just numbers. The more important issue is
Oh,
how does it affect
now? Earlier there were statistics. I see.
You're really
Okay.
bad at argument.
I want to change the debate just a little bit because I think we've discussed that quite a bit. What I want to ask you, Ryan, maybe you can shed some light on this. What do you think the motivation for the Attorney General as well as several Democratic legislatures for instating a law like this? What do we think the motivation behind it is?
People who have gone to jail are more likely to vote Democrat. Full stop. They don't care about the victims. They don't care about the process, or the way the process can be damaged. For instance, if you're convicted of voter fraud, you can come out of jail under Tick Seeger-Bloom's law and vote the next day. That's preposterous. That's terribly written, terribly thought out legislation.
Is voter fraud a felony, A or B?
It could
Nope.
be. Okay. So even worse, the legislation doesn't even affect that. I mean, that's a bigger problem, right? So voter fraud, that means if you come out of jail, you can still vote even if you've been convicted of voter fraud, right?
That's already the way it is.
So that's a problem with the way it is.
Now we should take that back?
Absolutely.
How about if you get busted for smoking pot? Should we take that away too?
No, that's
But
not.
we're not
it's not
discussing that,
different.
though.
Where do
We're
you draw the
discussing
line?
AB.
Because voter fraud directly relates to the voting process and smoking pot doesn't. I mean, that should be a fairly bright line.
How do you know? It clouds your thought and makes you choose the wrong decision.
But there's still
Where do
way
you draw
more
the line?
jumps to make
Okay.
between marijuana and voter fraud.
We want to
That's
stick with
preposterous solution.
class A and B felonies.
Right. So,
okay.
what was the question again? I'm
The
so
question is-
distracted by the
question
preposterous
is,
statements coming out of Alex's mouth.
It's I'll let you think about it. Sarah, I want to ask you, what do we think the motivation for a law like this would be?
I guess to give, since it is, the people committing the crimes, we can stereotype or say that they are minorities. It takes away their
Do you think
opportunity.
that there's any credibility to that statement, that it disproportionately harms minorities? Alex, we know what you think. Sarah?
Yes and no. I mean, whether it's minorities or whites or whoever it might be, I mean, these people are criminals. So to me, it really giving them that ability to, I understand that they want to be back in society and seem as normal as possible, but it is a right. Voting is a right, and me being born in the States but being a minority, I don't, to have that right, whether you're a criminal, it's just.
So you don't think this is necessarily a race issue?
No.
Okay.
I think part of the issue that no one's really responded to is the fact that people don't trust the law unless they have ability to change it, to engage in it. So that's why you see an increase in the number of violent crimes. Because if I do not believe that the police will protect me or that the law will protect me, I'm more likely to take it in my own hands, and that's when the violence comes in.
Alex,
and that's when the
I
problems
would
occur.
ask you, are they rehabilitated when they leave prison then? If they
should
are
be, yeah.
right on
That's
that
the goal
line,
of prison.
if voting is going to tip them one way or the other, if their right to vote is going to keep them or encourage them
Well, we
to
see
commit
your
a
slant
violent...
now in your political views.
I'm just-
I think
I'm
the
posing
fact
the
is,
question.
though, your question, the answer is clearly, if they have been rehabilitated and then you let them out and you further demonize them in the eyes of the law, they're more likely to go back to where they were before. So yes, they can be rehabilitated at that point and then causally go backwards and regress back to the state they were because they don't feel like the law helps them or society is going to protect them because they can't participate in it.
What do we think, David, about this? Do you think that the voting is going to prevent people from recommitting crimes?
Giving somebody the right to vote isn't going to prevent anybody from doing anything, first of all. Second, the thing is, it's supposed to reduce recidivism among, these criminals that come out of jail. And if it's going to help, and if there's proof that it can help, and it will actually work, then it should be something that should earnestly be considered. Obviously, there's still a lot of controversy over it, but it's supposed to help. And I would like to think that just like parole is supposed to help. And if it's going to help, then it should be considered. But that's my thoughts on it.
Can I just point out that nobody at this table is saying that they should permanently have their right to vote taken away. The argument here is Alex saying that those rights should be automatically restored, and then the three sane people at the table saying there should be a process by which felons are evaluated against process to determine if they should be allowed to have full franchise.
There's always a process, but it's a question of who determines what's correct in the process. My argument, which you've clearly mischaracterized, is the process you've allocated is unfair and not accessible to the people that are most likely to be affected and recreate violent crimes because of the institution.
What is a process that would, could you have like an idea maybe off the top of your head? I had to put you on the spot.
Yeah,
what would the process
prison.
look like?
That's the process of rehabilitation that should enable you to leave. They don't let you out on good behavior
Well, then why do we have
unless you've been in
parole?
prison. Huh?
Why do we have parole?
It's another means by which the state determines whether or not you're successful. I mean,
Isn't that also the process of rehabilitation?
It's a part of the process, but it's a way of checking up. And if you mess up your parole, you go back to prison, which means you can no longer vote because you're back in prison, which seems to resolve all of the issues you have with people that are still violent criminals from voting because they mess up on their parole and they go back to jail. You also haven't adjusted answer to the argument that what could a person who's going to vote on that would harm society? The bills are not that like drastic that they clearly harm a portion of society.
It's the way the law perceives a citizen, right? That lack of franchise is reflective of the damage that a violent person has done to somebody else, right? Who will never get back that part of their life.
All right,
But
guys,
you don't fix that by taking
I
away the right to
think
vote.
we might have to wait until next year to see what the Nevada legislature decides on that, but that is all the time we have for today. So now you clearly know what we think. Let us know what you think. Share your opinions and any ideas or topics you'd like us to scramble about to thescramble.unlv@gmail.com. You can also catch full episodes of The Scramble at unlv.tv. And for all of us here at The Scramble, thanks for joining us, and we hope to see you next time.